Alright guys, this is jerningham here. This newsman's talking about, this will give you an idea. Wales, outdoors, indoors, restrictions for children. Scotland, indoors and outdoors, exclusive to children. England, outdoors, outdoors and excluded to children, and indoors. So this gives you what the guy's going to be saying on the news.
And outside children aren't included in this number. There have been no changes in Northern Ireland, where
No changes in Northern Ireland.
Meeting indoors has been limited
People meeting
to
indoors.
6 people from up to 2 households.
Two households.
Since August, 15 people can still meet outdoors there. Let's head to the newsroom to speak to our correspondent Laura Bundock. So the rules are quite different depending where in the UK you live. How are they being received today? Do you think broadly the public is supportive of this?
I think the government certainly hopes that. They hope that the way we adhered to lockdown all those months ago is exactly how we'll approach
California's 22 people have died after fire broke out.
There has been some confusion,
middle August. Police given a new personnel stops and search.
Being or not being included.
Some people on outside on the beach and in the
figures, they're
grass.
A stark reminder as to why something needs to happen.
Offence is more likely to get caught and face
the rate at which one person passes
prison.
the virus on to somebody else is now over 1, which means the virus is starting to spread. We also know the number of people testing positive for the virus has been increasing for the 3rd day in a row.
Social more than 6 people are illegal in England.
So lots of worrying data there, which is why action was needed in order to try and stop it spreading further and to prevent a second peak coming. And that's clearly what many doctors are concerned about, thinking it's very likely that a second spike will now happen. They're also concerned about the number of people being tested.
Busy, see?
Although currently the UK is processing 227,000 tests every day, there are worries that there are big delays to the tests and that some people are still struggling to get their hands on
London
testing.
Airport says cutting of 239 jobs as part of restrictions plans. British Medical says the UK is at critical in fight against COVID-19. Nicola Sturgeon.
Backlog of test results being faced by the UK lab network, which the Glasgow Lighthouse Lab is part of, is starting to impact on the Timmy's reporting of Scottish results. We've been raising these concerns with the UK government in recent days. Indeed, over the weekend, the Health Secretary managed to resist a move to limit access to testing slots, mobile testing units and regional testing centres. However, this apparent delay in turnaround is causing us concern, and therefore we'll be seeking to escalate these discussions with the UK government over the course of today.
So clearly Nicola Sturgeon very worried there about those delays to testing, particularly perhaps in the Glasgow area where we know they've had to face extra lockdown measures. There are areas in England as well also facing extra lockdown measures, and the worry there is if you can't get the people in that area tested quick enough, then the virus will continue to spread. It'll be impossible to sort of stamp it out when these outbreaks occur. I think what this perhaps shows us, although the UK is carrying out overall a lot of testing, there is still a huge demand for testing, and the challenge is keeping up with that ever-increasing demand.
Okay, Laura, thanks for the update. To Brexit now, Conservative rebellion is emerging against the Prime Minister's controversial plan to override the Brexit withdrawal agreement ahead of a debate in the Commons that starts in a short time. The government has admitted that the UK Internal Market Bill could breach international law, but insists that it's just an insurance policy. Now, the proposed legislation has cast a huge shadow over the Brexit talks, which are due to resume this week. The Prime Minister's special envoy for freedom of religion and belief, Conservative MP Raymond Chishti, has resigned in protest at the bill. He said it would be contrary to the values he holds dearest. Meanwhile, David Cameron became the latest former Prime Minister to express reservations about Boris Johnson's plan to override the Brexit deal.
Passing an act of Parliament and then going on to break an international treaty obligation is the very, very last thing you should contemplate. It should be an absolute final resort. So I do have misgivings about what's being proposed. But I would just make this point. So far what's happened is the government has proposed a law that it might pass or might not pass or might use or might not use, depending on whether certain circumstances do or do not.
Prime Minister David Cameron used to be our Prime Minister, but he's not anymore. Boris Johnson's the Prime Minister.
With the European Union to get a deal, and I think we have to keep that context, that big prize, in mind.
Well, Home Office Minister Kit Malthouse told Sky's Kay Burley that the UK has no choice if it wants to keep the union together.
If we don't have this insurance policy, we could be in a position where food exports from GB to Northern Ireland become illegal and therefore can't happen. I think there's lots of people in the world that would look at the practical situation that's presented and say, well, the UK has no choice but to act in its own sovereign territory in a way that keeps the country whole. But no doubt colleagues will thrash that out this afternoon.
Let's bring in our political correspondent, Kate McCann. She's in Westminster for us this afternoon. A huge amount of anger, Kate, over this, and a resignation as well.
That's right. As you mentioned there, Raymond Chisty has handed in his resignation. He says that he believes once you agree to something, you just can't go back on it. And so he's not able to vote.
David Cameron, former EA6 Tory leader after Lord
There are lots of very
Howard,
senior Conservative
Sir John
MPs who've been
Majan,
talking about their misgivings,
Theresa
about
May's
how Boris Johnson and his team are going about this. They say
concern
it's
at
a
the
safety
bill.
net to make sure that trade between Northern Ireland and the UK can continue. But there are some who wonder whether actually this is the right price to be paying, even if that is what is at stake here, though some people say it isn't. So it's interesting, isn't it, that Boris Johnson will be opening this debate in the House of Commons this afternoon. He wasn't supposed to be. Another of his colleagues was lined up to do that, but the Prime Minister has stepped in at the relative last minute. And Michael Gove will be summing up. And speaking to those in number 10, they think it's really important for the Prime Minister to again reiterate exactly why this is happening, not least in the face of some pretty stinging criticism
Westminster,
from
London.
Geoffrey Cox, who was the Attorney General for Theresa May and crucially for Boris Johnson too. So a man with a real insight into what's going on here. And it's just worth reading you a couple of lines from his Times article today where he sets out his criticism of this bill. Because he says no British minister should solemnly undertake to observe treaty obligations with his fingers crossed behind his back. It is unconscionable that this country, justly famous for its regard for the rule of law around the world, should act in such a way. We, the British government and Parliament, have given our word. Our honour, our credibility, our self-respect and our future influence in the world all rest upon us keeping that word. Nothing less is worthy of Britain. Now, it's not just senior Conservatives, including Brexiteers, who've said that they are worried about what's happening this afternoon. Ed Miliband, Labour's Shadow Business and Energy Minister, said this earlier on today.
How can we, on the one hand, be saying you've got to obey the law, which we all say rightly as legislators, and then the government comes along and says, well, it's okay for us to break the law because it's in a specific and limited way. We can't be having that. What does it do when we stand up to the Chinas and the Russias for breaking international law and saying, you know, you've got to uphold international law? They're going to say, well, hang on a minute. You're Britain. You're saying you can break international law. Why can't we?
Now, interestingly, Ed Miliband wouldn't have known this when he spoke to Kay Burley this morning, but he will in fact be standing in for Sir Keir Starmer in the House of Commons this afternoon because the Labour leader is having to self-isolate at home after a member of his family came down with COVID-19 symptoms. They've been tested, but Sir Keir needs to stay at home and not in the House of Commons until he's given the all clear. And crucially, there are rules which say that in a debate on legislation, which is what's happening this afternoon, MPs cannot join in via Zoom or virtually. So Sir Keir is being replaced by Ed Miliband, and Rachel Reeves for Labour will be the one summing up. And this afternoon's debate will be worth watching out for because while there won't be a vote on that amendment that everybody's been talking about, the Bob Neal
Labour Party's got coronavirus. And Boris Johnson had coronavirus as well, but he's better.
To see how angry the Conservative Party are about what's happening on this bill.
Yeah, it could get very feisty indeed, couldn't it? Thank you very much, Kate McCann in Westminster for us. Now, a man has died and several other people have been injured in a major traffic collision in Kidbrooke in southeast London. Our correspondent Ashna Hurinag is there. Sounds awful, this, Ashna. What happened?
The immediate first thing to tell you is that this is a very quiet residential street. And when the ambulance service arrived here about 8 o'clock this morning, they promptly called the police. Clearly something alarmed them about this incident. And when you take a look behind me, you can see exactly why. What they arrived to find was a green lorry that appears to have careered onto the other side of the road.
Another accident in London.
Appears to have driven into 2 cars.
Man has died and several people have been injured in a imaginary traffic collision in Broken in southeast London.
ploughed into one of the white residential houses on the right-hand side of the road. We can't quite see inside that house, but I've had a look myself. The wall has been completely charred and has been completely eroded, so as the impact of this. What officers arrived to find was one man declared to have died at this scene almost immediately. He wasn't at all set into hospital, but he was deemed to have died almost immediately. He was the driver of that lorry, and now attempts are being made to try and find his next of kin and try and inform them of what's happened here. Another 2 people have also been taken to hospital, but as well as that, an 11-year-old child as well has also been taken to hospital. We understand it that child has life-threatening injuries. It's not clear whether that child or whether those other people who were injured were inside the house or whether they were passengers inside either of the 2 cars that this lorry drove into. As yet, it's unclear as to whether a police investigation has been started, but certainly lots of inquiries are going to need to try and happen now to try and establish exactly what happened here. As you saw a moment ago, a lot of police are still on the ground here. They're cordoned off certain areas, but the certain path is open to the public. You can still see the structural damage inside that house, but certainly a huge shock for everybody here to find out that not only is an 11-year-old child injured in this, but a man has died too.
Yeah, very sad. Ashna, thank you. The inquiry into the Manchester Arena attack has been watching tribute videos for each individual victim made by their families. It's a change of tone from last week when evidence was presented into the moments before Salman Abedi detonated.
Yeah, it was horrible, that Manchester evening attack where Ariana Grande did a concert there and it got blown up and some kids and people died a couple of years ago. And the bomber got arrested, died, has blew himself up, and his brother got arrested, I think. As I talk about this incident thing here.
Were taken from, and their memories of the lives of those 22 will be played out in these hearings over the course of the next 2 weeks. And today we've heard
Head of visitors to California, 22 people died.
29-year-old and perhaps one of the better known of those who died in the attack at the Ariana Grande concert back in May 2017. Martin was a PR manager who was 29 years old, a vivacious, outgoing guy who celebrated life every day of his life through social media videos. He was a Coronation Street superfan, even had a Deirdre Barlow tattoo on his leg. And his life was remembered by his family on his father's side, Paul, leading a family tribute video in which they described Martin's life and shared a bit of those finest moments of this 29-year-old.
Due to Martin's huge social media following, we have been asked many, many times by people, is Martin Het your son? And we reply, with all the pride in the world, yes, Martin is our son.
It was certainly very moving indeed, and we've heard also from the family of Aileen MacLeod, a 14-year-old schoolgirl from Barra in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland who was there at the arena that night, and we heard from her family how going to concerts was one of the things that was one of the best things about the things that she enjoyed, and it was a tribute really that was incredibly beautifully put together from the beaches of Barra. And we also heard from some of her teachers paying tribute to a warm, funny girl with an enormous amount of potential.
What a privilege it was for me to have her in my class as a lovely young woman. She was the kind of girl who smiled all the time. She giggled, she was happy. You're taught when you're teaching in school not to have favourites, but some children just stick with you, and she was certainly one of these girls.
These moving tributes will continue for the next 2 weeks in this inquiry process, and we should also remember all those who were psychologically impacted by the bomb and the events that they saw that night, and those who've been through horrendous injuries trying to rebuild their lives. They too very much part of the thoughts of everyone in this city at the moment as this inquiry process moves forward. And it will answer some very searching questions, but this phase of the inquiry very much about putting the victims of that night front and centre of everyone's thoughts.
Tom Palmer there in Manchester for us. More now on the new Rule of Six law, which came into force in England today. The new coronavirus restriction will limit socialising both indoors and outdoors, but will people stick to the rules? Let's find out and speak to Stephen Reicher, a professor of social psychology at the University of St Andrews and an independent SAGE member. Good to see you this afternoon on Sky News. Thanks for being with us. So the new Rule of Six then, is it the right thing at the right time?
Well, clearly, we're in a crisis with the infections spiking, and it seems now that hospitalizations, even deaths, are increasing. So we've got to do something. There's no doubt about that. And in broad terms, there are two types of things you can do. First of all, you limit people's exposure to other people. So you limit the extent to which people get infected. And then you improve your test and trace system so as to stop things spreading, to stop the infection spreading. So it's quite right to limit exposure by limiting the number of people we see at home. But the problem that I have with it is it's not joined up policy. At the same time that we're limiting how you can see people at home, we're still encouraging people to go back to work and so to be in contact with others, to be exposed on public transport, to be exposed at workplaces. We're still encouraging people to go to bars and restaurants, thereby increasing exposure. So I think we need much more joined up policy where we look in the round at how we can limit exposure. And then, of course, there are all the problems with test and trace.
Yeah, but of course there is a balance to be struck here, isn't there, between protecting people's health, but also protecting the economy, getting people to spend money, and also allowing people an element of personal freedom.
Well, first of all, I think that would be a reasonable argument if workplaces were safe. But figures that came out last week showed that 6% of workplaces, this is according to employers, aren't socially distancing. And as ever, the most vulnerable of workers are hardest hit. So 38% of those on insecure contracts report that nothing is being done to protect them. So we need a much more robust policy towards making spaces safe. And on top of that, the argument that there's a trade-off between public health and economy doesn't really stand up when you look at the global statistics. Those show on the whole that the countries which are most robust on public health are those who are doing best economically. And the reasons for that are fairly straightforward. If you push down the infection, then you can reopen more fully. The more robust you are, the more confident you can be that things aren't going to change, so businesses don't get uncertainty. And on top of that, people are going to be more confident to go out into the economy. So what is good for public health is good for the economy.
We've seen infection rates rise in the UK, but we haven't seen admissions to hospital or deaths rise in a similar fashion. What do you put that down to? And doesn't that mean that we're getting better at managing this?
Well, there are many issues involved there. The first thing to be said is that for a while, people thought that the damage of this disease was whether it killed you or not. We're now learning that actually that isn't the case, and so-called long COVID can mean that people who recover are affected for a long, long time. This is a nasty disease, and we shouldn't underestimate it. Secondly, of course, there is a lag between infections and hospitalizations. So we need to wait and see what's going to happen in terms of those. But overall, we want to limit infections because whoever gets it, it's bad news.
Very worryingly, we've seen Israel go into a second full national lockdown. Do you think that is something that maybe could happen here?
Well, the answer to that, of course, is it depends. It depends on the two factors that I spoke about. So I mentioned, first of all, limiting exposure and the need for a joined-up policy. It's no point limiting exposure in one domain while increasing it in the other domain. And the other area, of course, is the test and trace system. And that, quite frankly, is a shambles at the moment. And the problem is, some of the problems we don't even talk about or address. So it's not just about getting people tested. It's not just about getting people to reveal their contacts. The system is all about getting people to isolate. And the figures that came out very recently show that only 20% or so of people actually self-isolate. And one of the core reasons for that is you're asking people to self-isolate and take a big financial hit. And it raises all sorts of practical problems as well. So I think people, the public, we need to take our responsibilities seriously. Quite self-evidently we need to, but equally the government needs to take its responsibilities seriously and to help us to do the right thing, to support people properly to self-isolate, to make sure that workplaces and pubs and restaurants are safe. And quite frankly, that's not happening at the moment.
So I'm interested when you say that you fear that pubs, restaurants, workplaces aren't safe. Does that mean you're not going to any of those places yourself then? Are you making the decision that it's not safe to go to those places personally?
Well, let me say there is good data to suggest these things. I've already pointed to the data which shows that large numbers of workplaces aren't safe, not because employers are necessarily bad people. They're trying very hard, but they need support. There also needs to be an increase in the extent to which we inspect and we certify those spaces. And sadly, over the last 5 years, health and safety inspectors have been cut by half. So again, we need those structures to be in place to make sure, not just to say we hope employers will make spaces safe, but to make sure that they're safe and to make sure that people aren't asked to go back to workplaces until they know that they're safe. In terms of pubs and restaurants, the same applies. Research in the States, for instance, showed that of people who were infected, they were twice as likely in the last 14 days to have been to restaurants and to bars. And again, what we need is a more robust system of inspection, of certification, so people can be confident when they go to a space that they know it's going to be safe. It will increase confidence. And it's, relatively speaking, certainly relative to the £100 billion that the government are talking about in terms of moonshot, it's money.
As you can see, my phone's on low battery. The torch has gone off here. With my fingers pointing here.
Yeah, so just to go back to my original question, I mean, if personally you're worried about that risk factor, does that mean you're not going to restaurants and pubs at the moment because you don't feel that the government is making them safe enough?
Well, last Friday, we were planning to go to a restaurant with some friends, and in the light of the figures at the moment, we decided that we wouldn't do it. But I mean, the important thing is here, it's not just either they're open or they're closed. As I say, we need much more robust systems to give people confidence. If people saw on going to a restaurant or a bar a big certificate saying this has been inspected and this place is COVID safe, and please report if there are any problems, I think people will be a lot more confident. So we're not trying to make life more difficult, we're trying to make life safer and to give people more confidence and being more robust and more systematic in what we do, rather than just handing over responsibility and saying, well, you make it safe. If we had more systematic procedures, I think we will be increasing confidence and thereby protecting our economy.
Yeah, you certainly make a very interesting point. Systems and procedures do seem to vary depending on where you go. We must leave it there. Professor Stephen Reicher, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of food for thought there. You're watching Sky News. Still to come, the blame game, President Trump on the wildfires that killed 33 people.
Well, guys and girls, hope you've all enjoyed the video. Give it a like, give it a comment, share it with your friends. And I shall catch you in the next video. I'm sorry I've had to end the stream because the phone's a low battery. Got to charge up to make more videos. Turn it from peace. Look, take it easy.